Welcome back, everyone. And I know we're in for a very interesting session on another kind of medium from what Mark talked about. Senior College prides itself on being multidisciplinary, and the Hutcheons are excellent examples of that. Michael is a respirologist from the Faculty of Medicine. Linda is a noted literary scholar and critic. Together, they turn out to be experts on opera and are going to give us a very interesting talk. Please unmute yourselves and begin. Thank you.
Thank you, Margaret. Our appropriately violent title, I suppose appropriate at least for this symposium, comes from what's actually been called a breezy slapstick romance. It was composed by a young Mozart, and it's about the encounter between Europeans and Turks. It premiered in Vienna in 1782, 100 years after the Turkish Ottoman Empire's troops had been stopped, but right at the gates of the city. Enormously popular at the time, it's what's called a Singspiel. It's performed in German with sung arias, but spoken dialogue. The translated words of our title, the violent ones, are sung by a Turkish character named Osmin, and he's telling us what he'd like to do to the European males in the plot if he could get his hands on them. And these violent words are in fact repeated frequently by him throughout the entire opera. And here is what Osmin looks and sounds like. This is from a traditional comic production from Munich in 1989 of Mozart's Abduction from the Seraglio. Oops. Sorry, we're just having our first technical difficulty. Though comic, even in this other production image that we're showing you, Osmin's barbaric cruelty and violence, his despotic taste for torture, his dark, irrational rage, in short, the very opposite of the European Enlightenment ideal of rationality from Mozart's Vienna, all of these are absolutely stereotypical representations of the saber-wielding Muslim Turk on the 18th century European stage. Now, of course, Mozart didn't invent these operatic cliches of language and behavior, or even of costuming and sets. In his time, there was a recognized form known as the Turkish opera, and its plot, always about the confrontation of East and West, is pretty standard and recognizably that of the Abduction from the Seraglio, as well as, I must say, dozens of other works.
And here it is. A Spanish nobleman, here named Belmonte, attempts to rescue his betrothed Constanza from the Seraglio, or palace, of the Turkish Pasha Selim. And this palace is overseen by Osmin, the sadistic, raging fellow we just met. The Seraglio and its harem are where the stereotypes of the despotic East take to the boards of the Western stage. Violence, cruelty, torture, captivity, and sexual coercion for sensuality was also part of that Eastern stereotype. The European characters, in turn, are also represented as people very much of their times, so they manifest what our modern ears might hear as xenophobic Orientalist views, not to mention prejudices about both gender and class. It happens that Belmonte's servant, Pedrillo, has also been abducted along with his female love interest, an English woman named Blonde, who just happens to be Constanza's maid. When Belmonte's rescue of the three Europeans is thwarted, the Pasha Selim, the only role in the opera that is totally spoken, discovers that Belmonte is in fact the son of his mortal enemy, someone who took from him his social position, his property, and his loved one. But instead of executing his enemy's son and the others in revenge, Selim chooses to repay injustice with mercy rather than evil. He liberates the Europeans and thereby not only makes this potential tragedy into a comedy, but in the process, the Pasha becomes the flip side of Osmin's Turkish opera stereotype, that is, the benevolent and magnanimous Islamic ruler, acting like an exemplar of the Enlightenment, or a character in a European opera seria.
No one ever said stereotyping was an uncomplicated social process, right? Turks for Mozart's Viennese could be benign or malevolent, laughable or dangerous, sensual or despotic. Today, we're going to look at the differences in the expectations and possible responses of two different audiences to this opera's verbal and physical violence, and what we today might see as its sexism and racism, its anti-Muslim and class prejudices. First, we'll consider the original Vienna audience of 1782, about to celebrate the 100th anniversary of their defeat of the Ottoman Turks. And then we'll look at an audience a few years ago in multicultural Toronto, far from the history of 18th century European East-West relations, but certainly embroiled in its own cultural politics of difference, shall we say. We'll look at the choices made by the librettist and composer in the 18th century and how they play out today. And we'll do that by exploring the rewriting of the opera's text and the reimagining of its mise en scène by Lebanese-Canadian playwright Wajdi Mouad for the Canadian Opera Company in 2018. He was both the librettist and the director. Now, in this version, those early comic but violent Orientalist stereotypes of Muslim Turks are transformed into ethically and emotionally complex figures, and serious Islamic ritual replaces racist slapstick action. Not surprisingly, of course, en route, the comedy turns into a serious, historically contextualized drama about Europeans of their day, with all their prejudices, arriving in a more progressive and tolerant Turkey than they could ever have imagined, given those very prejudices.
Now, in order to get there, we have to begin by trying to convince you that an art form as artificial and extravagant as opera can actually help us understand and even confront culturally accepted prejudices. And to do this, we'll be talking about the mechanisms and power of cultural stereotyping in the arts, but especially in what is called Orientalist art, like this. Themes of violence and sensuality are at the core of Western representations, that is, stereotypes, of Eastern Islamic cultures. And the Turkish Seraglio was for centuries the particular obsession of the European male gaze.
This kind of Orientalism is at the heart of opera's entire history, as we'll then briefly explore. Its European origins coincide with the escalation of the East-West conflict that, let's face it, is still with us today. This will allow us to zero in on late 18th century Vienna, its history, its political and cultural life. In short, the context that made Mozart's version of the typical Turkish opera possible in 1782, but arguably impossible in 2018.
So let's begin then with the power and function of stereotyping. And here we don't want to consider just a negative concept, but as an activity that is really human, all too human. The psychological impulse to categorize people, objects, actions, whatever, into recognizable groups is human cognition's way of dealing with life's complexities and possible dangers. And it is through repeated contacts from multiple sources, real-world experiences or cultural products, that we come to understand something as having relatively fixed associated characteristics. We call stereotyping the obvious oversimplification, the flattening out of differences that can lead to the widely circulated normalizing of those associations. And while helpful as a heuristic way of dealing with the complexities of the world, such categories can also be dangerously essentialist, and their generalizations can easily lead to prejudice and discrimination. As this American recruiting poster from the First World War shows, nations at war have always relied on creating this kind of dehumanizing stereotype to mobilize a population towards violence, here to fight the enemy.
Opera, like all the arts, can also deal in stereotypes. And that's because, as Jane Tompkins has noted, stereotypes are the instantly recognizable representatives of overlapping racial, sexual, national, ethnic, economic, social, political, and religious categories. They convey enormous amounts of cultural information in an extremely condensed form. So for economy of communication, then, we recognize these shorthand, these telegraphic versions of what our particular society accepts as given. And so they're triggered, we might say, without much intermediary thought.
From the early Commedia dell'arte to Brecht and beyond, stereotypes had been incarnated on the stage in the form of stock dramatic characters. And like other aesthetic conventions, such stereotypes have developed over time, and they function to enable an artist like Mozart's librettist, for example, to create with greater speed and to connect more readily with his Viennese audience, for whom these familiar conventions work to facilitate both understanding and pleasure. Through the repetition of such conventions, operas not only help create, but also reinforce the cultural cliches of their time through precisely that repetition. Thus, the figure of the Muslim Turk would trigger, in Mozart's audience, associations of violence and cruelty.
Now, we admit that opera is an extravagant, over-the-top, and also artificial art form. After all, everybody sings. But what if that were exactly the reason why it could be helpful in exploring cultural stereotypes? So opera inflates, it pushes to extremes. It's larger than life, but derived from life. Offering a kind of cultural magnifying glass, it enlarges and can allow us to see perhaps more clearly. Nevertheless, because of its music, and music by Mozart in this case, in its very extravagance and artificiality, opera also allows us as audience members to respond deeply to this emotional and moral experience through the music, but at the same time, we can also distance ourselves through the knowledge that this extreme experience is coming to us safely from within the artificial world of art, not life.
Now, sometimes, as Sander Gilman has argued, the particular cultural stereotypes of the non-European other that interest us here may be projections onto that other of anxieties in us with deep psychic roots. From the start, European opera has certainly been part of the propagation of such fraught stereotypes of otherness, especially those involving issues of race, sexuality, or pathology. The birth of opera in the late Renaissance coincides with the rise of European colonialism and its impact on Europe's sense of itself and its other. Opera, it has been argued, through dramatic and musical representations of otherness, provided potent new means of depiction and representation, and thus powerful new means of control and containment.
The 16th century Italy, into which opera was born as an art form, also saw the creation of two of the great epic poems of the time, Ariosto's Orlando Furioso in 1532 and Tasso's Gerusalemme Liberata, Jerusalem Delivered, 1581. Both of these are about the clash of Christian Europe and the Muslim Middle East. And this was a theme of great concern to Europeans at the time, given the Ottoman Empire's relentless military advances through Eastern Europe. And literally dozens and dozens of operas were derived from these poems. In short, opera's origins are tightly connected to Orientalism. Orientalism as it was defined by Edward Said over 30 years ago. This is Europe's mode of culturally, imaginatively dominating, restructuring, and having authority over the Orient. The Orient meaning, by the way, in Said's case, the Middle East, as in our case here. Not only is Orientalism, though, a way of defining the East, it's a way of allowing the West to construct itself as the opposite of the East. We've already seen that Osmin is made into the European other by his being Turkish, violent, and irrational. By the 18th century, Mozart's audience in Enlightenment Vienna likely felt both attraction and animosity to this Turkish other. They would have at once been fascinated by Osmin's, to them at least, exotic religious and cultural differences. So his dress, his music, his choice of words, maybe even his violent behavior. But they'd also been convinced of their own superiority as civilized, rational Europeans over their once greatly feared, and that's important, traditional enemies, what they called the primitive or barbarian Muslim Turks.
Now that said, Europe's early contact with Islam had certainly warranted fear. It was the fearsome conquering Arab armies that spread their religion from Mecca and Medina in the 7th century to the Levant, Persia, North Africa, and then by the 8th century into Spain and France. Centuries of hostilities ranging from low-grade skirmishes to full-out wars characterized from then on the encounters of Christian Europe and the Muslim East. From the 14th century onward, It was the Ottoman Turks that had become dominant in the Muslim world, moving originally from the area around the Aral Sea into Persia before settling in Anatolia, present-day Turkey. At its peak, when the Ottoman troops laid siege to Vienna in 1528 and again in 1683, most of the Mediterranean basin was under Turkish control, as you can see here in green, and the empire, the Ottoman Empire, was encroaching on Western Europe. Vienna became known as the Porta Orientalis. This is where the East began. The added threat of the Barbary pirates from the north coast of Africa, whose incursions were embedded in the Mediterranean economy, brought European economic worries along with personal fears of being captured for either ransom or sale by Muslim slave traders. Now, the fact that the Austrians soundly defeated the Turks in 1683 meant that a century later, despite ongoing conflicts, the Ottoman Empire was ceasing to be a serious military threat to Europe and had inspired a more harmless but decidedly exotic style of fashion. But as Matthew Head reminds us, however much musical and literary representations of the Turk in Mozart's Vienna were products of fashion and popular taste, they were not innocent of political and military consequences. They were not contained by the walls of the opera house and the home, but were strategically redeployed as Austria and Russia carved up the Eastern European holdings of a territorially diminishing Ottoman Empire.
So, when the 25-year-old Mozart arrived in Vienna in 1781, the Habsburg Emperor Joseph II was preparing to host the Russian crown prince sent by Catherine the Great to negotiate that very carving up of Turkish-held lands. So what better way, in a way, to entertain him than to commission a comic operatic work about, or maybe against, the Turks. The 1783 celebrations for the anniversary of the Second Siege of Vienna provided the perfect occasion for a triumphant comedy in which all the stereotypes of both Europeans and Turks could be staged as a manifest consolidation of the reversals of fortune in that historical conflict between Austria and the Ottoman Empire. And what better place to perform this than under the auspices of Joseph II's newly created National Singspiel Theater. To that end, its director, Gottlieb Stefani, commissioned young Mozart to set a slightly altered version of a previously performed libretto by Friedrich Bretzner. And what's really surprising is it turned out no one at the time was in the least concerned about the cruelty or violence in the libretto. Even the ubiquitous and very fussy censor, who it turned out only cared about sexually suggestive moments.
It wasn't only the exotic setting and comically violent storyline of despotic Turks in the Abduction from the Seraglio that provided this celebratory appropriation of things Turkish. Mozart also drew on musical stereotypes, masculine music associated with military power. That is, Western imitations of the percussive sound of the bands that accompanied the elite Turkish Janissary troops. This Alaturka music in the West codified certain rhythms, intervals, and note patterns as recognizably Turkish to the ears of the European public. In other words, the addition of cymbals, bells, triangle, and bass drums alone at the start of the overture of the opera signaled to the Viennese audience that they were about to see a Turkish opera. And now, moving to the end, this is how the opera finishes. So by the time Mozart was writing this music was fashionable in European courts and had influenced the style of military bands everywhere.
In other words, Mozart's 18th century audience would have recognized all of these stereotypes, dramatic and musical, as stereotypes of the East. Operas like The Abduction from the Seraglio then reflected, but also helped shape the attitude and behavior of Westerners toward the non-Western world. But what about today's audiences? To return to Sander Gilman's theories, stereotypes are historically and culturally constructed, therefore they're malleable, changing with time as well as place. And changes in political or social ideologies actually come to alter the operatic stereotype and therefore its cultural meaning. So the misogynist and Islamophobic messages embedded, at least for modern eyes and ears, in Mozart's opera might be obstacles for many audience members today. So what's to be done? Well, contemporary opera directors have sometimes tried to translate or to recontextualize the earlier stage cliches into something today's audiences would relate to. Sometimes, especially after 9/11, they went for the frightening Islamic terrorist stereotypes, as you can see here. At other times, they created a fantastical Middle East in whimsical comic stagings. Still, other directors ignored the Orientalist elements entirely, as did this one in Berlin, setting the work in a brutal European brothel.
The Canadian Opera Company, in conjunction with the Opéra National de Lyon in France, chose a very different approach, deciding to confront head-on the changes in the valences and meanings of standard cultural stereotypes of the Muslim East. Wajdi Mouad's rewriting of the spoken text and his reimagining in non-Orientalist imagery of the stage world of the opera turned a comic Singspiel into a moving opera seria. Those earlier cliches of class, gender, and religion were turned on their heads, even if the temporal setting was still Mozart's 18th century. What Mouad did was to subversively contest the dominance of those historically validated operatic stereotypes by creating a counter-discourse to them to undermine their stability and authority. To do this, Mouad constructed an elaborate dramatic frame for the work. The production opens, even before the overture begins, with an added spoken scene set in an elegant chandeliered room in 18th century Europe, where family and friends are celebrating the rescue and return of the 4 Europeans. Belmonte's father is heard pompously praising the sons and daughters of the Enlightenment and their courage in the face of adversity. To celebrate their deliverance, he has imported a game called Tête de Turc, and as the overture starts, the party guests take turns hitting the wooden head of the Turk with clubs, to the rhythm and sound of the Turkish Janissary cymbals in the score. But Constanza and Blonde, the 2 rescued women, both refused to join in this cruel game. After all, the Turkish Pasha had actually saved all their lives. Constanza, we also learn, hates being back in Europe, where she is forced to be someone she no longer is, where she has changed in the 2 years of her captivity. When Belmonte calls her ungrateful, she demands that he tell her his version of the rescue story, and then she will tell him hers from her perspective. As she watches from the sidelines, Belmonte sings the first aria of the opera as part of a flashback narrative.
The production then shifts between the framing dialogue of the characters, often seen at the side of the stage sitting like this, and the action of Mozart's opera itself on the main stage, in which some of the original dialogue remains, though reduced, and in which all of the words of the musical parts are retained from the original. Nothing's changed in the music or its words. But given the audience's double perspective, almost a constant double vision of the frame on the side of the stage and the action in the middle, the context of each gesture and each word sung or spoken is changed. We certainly don't find ourselves in the stereotypical, despotic, erotic Turkish Seraglio. The harem women here are modestly dressed in red and seen reading. They actually teach the young girls you can see at their desks on the stage. The second half of the piece opens with a Muslim call to prayer, and then almost 3 minutes of praying before the action and music of Mozart's opera begin. We're in a very different Middle Eastern world than the one seen at Vienna's premiere, as the resolutely non-Orientalist set you can see here makes clear. And Turkey clearly isn't as regressive, as repressive as the stereotypes of earlier times would suggest. In fact, repeatedly, when East is compared with West, they're either parallel worlds, so both treat servants as servants, for example, or the East turns out to almost trump the West in terms of virtue and rationality.
But what about the vicious, vindictive Osmin stereotype that figures so largely in Mozart's opera? Well, in this version, he is deeply in love with Blonde, who, yes, has been given to him by Pasha Selim. But in fact, they are actually expecting a child, and when we first meet Osmin, he is making a delicate origami mobile for the baby. If he becomes enraged, and he does, it is because one or the other of the European men has acted towards him in a manner that is offensive and abusive. So he sings the violent words of our title in a total rage. Yes, that's true, but it's because in this new context, he loves Blonde and he hates the European men whom he sees as philandering seducers and who he fears will take her away from him, which of course they do. For Osmin, love is everything. For the servant Pedrillo, it's just a joke. And while Pedrillo says he cares for Blonde, he is actually busy trying to seduce the other women in the Seraglio. I'm afraid the two European men don't come off very well in this version of the story at all. Pedrillo is a deceiving, opportunistic, sometimes violent man who treats Blonde as his possession. Now, Osmin might like to do that, but he doesn't. In fact, in the duet sung by Osmin and Blonde, though the libretto's words are of insult, argument, and rejection, it is performed as teasing, indeed affectionate banter. Osmin even lies his head in Blonde's lap. This all, of course, befits Mozart's decidedly unsinister music for that duet. Muad, as a director, listens to the music as well as the words.
But there's a revealing added dialogue added by Muad in this version. Costanza complains that despite differences in language, religion, and thought, the Turks and the Europeans actually treat women in the same way, as creatures to be both venerated and constrained. Only the means of constraint differ, she suggests. Pasha Selim declares his love openly, but respects her constancy to another. When he tries to persuade her to marry him by threatening torture, in this version, he whispers the words lovingly in her ear and embraces her. He too at one point lies with his head on his beloved's lap. Her European lover is presented rather differently. The original text itself foregrounds Belmonte's constant worries about his Constanza's fidelity. I guess he forgot her name in the process. He arrives in Turkey worrying primarily about whether Costanza has stayed true to him, not whether she's even alive. But Muad's version carries his jealousy and distrust even further, until Constanza, exasperated by his totally unfounded anger, says to him, "Do you love me enough to understand that I could have loved another?" 2 years in the company of Selim, a generous and honorable man who has respected her fidelity to Belmonte, even has daily professed his growing love for her, this has changed Costanza irrevocably.
At the end of Muad's version, we learn that the beloved woman whom Belmonte's father abducted from Selim was none other than Belmonte's mother, now deceased. And it is out of love for her that the noble Selim lets the Europeans go free, for he, unlike Belmonte's father, would never steal the love of another. More enlightened and humane and arguably more Christian than the Spaniard he calls a barbarian, Selim turns the other cheek, liberating his own new loved one, Constanza. And her final act in the opera is to reach out yearningly towards this man whom she did indeed love. As the European chandeliers descend, she knows that she's now entrapped in a world to which she no longer can relate. To conclude briefly, this production offers a deliberate contemporary counter-discourse. As Toronto critic Joseph So put it, I've come to accept the notion that abduction as a sort of 18th century slapstick no longer works in today's world, where different societies and cultures are more interconnected than ever. Is he right to be concerned? It's true that stereotypes change meaning, but not really quickly and not without conscious effort. In Mozart's Vienna, audiences were being encouraged to see the Muslim Turks as their violent traditional enemies, and therefore the Viennese were justified in taking back conquered territories from the Ottoman Empire. In 21st century multicultural Toronto, we're talking about our neighbors. Stereotyping is occurring today, as we know, and the move from stereotype to violence is all too easy. The need to combat intolerance and violence is as pressing as ever, and counter-discourses in contemporary life, or even in opera, are important ways of fighting back. Thank you very much.